We will now come to order. Without objections, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the subcommittee at any time. Without objections, members of the full committee not on this subcommittee are authorized to participate in today's hearing. Members are reminded to keep their video function on at all times, even when they are not recognized by the chair. Members are also reminded that they are responsible for muting and unmuting themselves and to mute themselves after they are finished speaking. The staff have been instructed to only mute members and witnesses as appropriate. When not recognized, to avoid inadvertent background noise. Members are reminded that all House rules relating to order and decorum apply to this remote hearing. This hearing is entitled By the Numbers, How Diversity Data Can Measure Commitment to Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Now, I recognize myself for 4 minutes to give an opening statement. Good morning, and thank you to all the members and witnesses for joining us this morning. D&I is not new. Several Congresses ago, our Chairwoman called on the GAO to study this issue and persistently call for leaders in the financial services sector to embrace, in good faith, diversity, equity, and inclusion throughout their businesses. During that time, racial wealth disparities have increased. Home ownership rates for minorities have fallen, and women, people of color, continue to pay higher discretionary fees when leveraging financial services. In January, we called upon the Biden administration to take immediate steps to embrace diversity and inclusion, and the president responded by lifting the Trump ban on diversity and inclusion, training programs supporting the LGBT community and promoting racial equity at all 15 of his federal cabinet members and throughout the agencies. In fact, the Department of Treasury announced this week that they will conduct a racial equity audit to ensure it is achieving economic fairness and meeting the needs of all Americans. Today, we are calling upon the regulated financial entities to fully disclose their diversity data. Only through the transparent examination of performance benchmarks will we achieve lasting and sustainable opportunities for women and people of color in the financial services sector. Good diversity and inclusion performance has been proven unequivocally to increase innovation and profitability while lowering regulatory risk. Nevertheless, analysis by the GAO Office, Government Accountability Office, of diversity performance trends in senior leadership roles from 2007 to 2015 found the hiring and promotion of African Americans declined and the rate for women remained unchanged. To address the poor performances and achieve greater accountability, Chairwoman Maxine Waters led the enactment of Section 342 of Dodd-Frank. Congress's intent under Section 342 for the Offices of Minority and Women Inclusion, or OMWIs, to conduct oversight of the diversity and inclusion performance of regulated entities. On average, more than 80% of regulated entities have failed to share any metrics of D&I performances with their primary regulators. By any measurement, the voluntary self-assessment of diversity and inclusion performances by regulated entities has failed to meet the spirit and intent of the statute. Today, I will introduce the Diversity Data Accountability Act, which will make the sharing of diversity data pursuant to Section 342 mandatory. Last year, the House Financial Services Committee published a report analyzing diversity and inclusion performance at the nation's 44 largest banks because many had failed to share this data with their OMWIs, and we wanted to make sure that we were moving the needle in diversity and inclusion. Today, I am announcing that we will send diversity data surveys to the Americans' 31 largest investment management firms who manage more than $47 trillion in assets. Without objections, I would like to enter and submit this letter for inclusion in the record. For the benefit of the economy of all of us, will not rest. What gets measured gets done. The chair now recognizes the ranking member, the gentlewoman, and my colleague from Missouri for 5 minutes. The floor is yours, Madam Ranking.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and my friend Joyce Beatty. It is a pleasure, as always, to be working with you again on this subcommittee, and I hope that we can come together to discuss the most successful strategies to foster a diverse and inclusive workplace within the financial services industry. Republicans agree that there is more work to be done to improve diversity and inclusion, particularly in the executive level. Industry has acknowledged this and has taken great initiative to address the challenges related to recruiting and retaining minorities and women. As this committee considers policies related to diversity and inclusion, it is important that we remember to structure them in a way that, as our witness, Mr. Wade, has said in his testimony, is flexible and durable. Mr. Wade goes on to say that, and I quote, an initiative that might make sense in a highly populated metropolitan area might not make such sense in a rural one. I support your sentiment, Mr. Wade, and truly believe that a one-size-fits-all approach will not allow the financial services industry to really reap the benefits of our country's diversity. Diversity and inclusion, while related, are separate issues that should be addressed. Companies should expand their recruitment outreach, but it's equally as important to make sure that the environment is inclusive for retention. Without an inclusive workplace, diversity efforts will not yield the results that a business might be seeking. We know that an employee is more likely to stay with a company if it is, in fact, inclusive. In this subcommittee, we have discussed ways that a business can improve retention and develop a more inclusive workplace. Those best practices include transparency regarding salaries and promotion opportunities, mentoring and sponsorship programs, employee research groups, and flexible work hours, especially for our working moms. Cultural barriers or attitudes within a workplace cannot be removed without legislation or cannot be removed through regulation or legislation. Results that benefit both the employee and employer will come from within the company and require buy-in and active engagement from the top down. These results, while slow, are moving in the right direction with the help of organizations such as the U.S. Chamber of Commerce through their Equality of Opportunity Initiative and countless others. We must remember that diversity data can be an important measure in understanding diversity in the financial services sector and industry. However, this data may not provide a complete picture of the company's commitment to diversity and inclusion. In addition to data, we should continue to understand the unique obstacles each company faces in recruiting and retaining a diverse workforce, and learn from their creative solutions in overcoming those challenges. If this subcommittee is going to consider new policies that are data-driven, then we must ensure that the data collected allows companies to tell their own stories and highlight key areas of concern and success. I want to thank all of our witnesses for testifying today, and I look forward to our discussion. Thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the chair of the full committee, the gentlewoman from California, for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Ms. Beatty, for holding this hearing today. Today, we're continuing to hold the financial services industry accountable for diversity and inclusion. I'm pleased to partner with you, Ms. Beatty, in requesting diversity data and policies from America's largest investment firms, in addition to having an abysmal record of diversity within their investment firms. They have also not made it a priority to do business with diverse-owned asset managers and other businesses. Their excuses are not new and are laden with long-standing, unfounded biases against diverse-owned asset managers who perform as well or better than their white-owned counterparts. And so investment firms and others in the industry have also been reticent to share this data, but the data are needed to not only show the failing record, but to document their improvement. So I look forward to discussing solutions to increase disclosure of diversity data, which is indeed material to investors and information that Congress and the public should have access to. I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you, Ms. Beatty.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Today, we welcome the testimony of 5 witnesses. Thomas DiNapoli is the Comptroller of New York State and is testifying on behalf of the New York State Common Retirement Fund. Daniel Garcia-Diaz is the Managing Director, Financial Markets and Community Investment Team, U.S. Government Accountability Office. Carolynn Johnson is the Chief Executive Officer at DiversityINC. Ann Simpson, Managing Investment Director, Sustainable Investment, CalPERS. Rick Wade is the Senior Vice President of Strategic Alliances and Outreach at the United States Chamber of Commerce. Witnesses are reminded that your oral testimony will be limited to 5 minutes. A chime will go off at the end of your time, and I ask that you respect the members and other witnesses' time by wrapping up your oral testimony. Without objection, your written statement will be made part of the record. I now will call on Mr. DiNapoli. You are now recognized for 5 minutes to give oral testimony of your presentation.
Good morning, Chairwoman Beatty, Ranking Member Wagner, Chairwoman Waters, Ranking Member McHenry, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I commend the members of this committee for your collective focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion in corporate America. Following last spring's murder of George Floyd, which spurred an overdue national reckoning on systemic, generational racial injustice, many publicly traded corporations made commitments to address racial inequities. Those inequities are certainly stark. The boards of the 3,000 largest publicly traded companies remain overwhelmingly white. According to Institutional Shareholder Services, underrepresented minority groups make up 40% of the U.S. population, but just 12.5% of board directors. Black directors represent just 4%, Black women just 1.5%. Now, finally, we need more than talk. We need tangible actions in the form of increased numbers of Black and brown directors on corporate boards and throughout workforces to more accurately reflect what America looks like. Research has shown that companies face risks when their policies, practices, products, or services are or are perceived to be discriminatory. By contrast, companies that foster diversity and develop a culture of inclusion, equity, and belonging are better positioned to drive long-term value for shareholders. More than ever before, it's imperative for investors to encourage their portfolio companies to address DEI-related issues. To do so, investors must have timely access to accurate DEI information disclosed in a standardized manner to enhance the consistency and comparability of the information for investors to use. Here at the State Comptroller's Office, our DEI policies, practices, and strategies start in-house. They're reflected at every level, including the senior level. As trustee of the state's pension fund, I've hired 3 women to serve as chief investment officer, including 2 Black women over the past 14 years. We also have set a high standard in investing in MWBE and emerging managers. We're very proud of the fact that we have more than $6.7 billion managed by emerging managers, approximately $20 billion in total MWB investments and commitments, representing a quarter of our externally managed capital. As long-term shareholders, we invest across the entire economy. Our fund works to promote environmental, social, and governance practices that are sound at our portfolio companies. From board and workforce diversity to pay equity, the fund has been advocating for better corporate policies, disclosure, and reporting that can lead to sustainable long-term value for shareholders. Recently, the fund has prioritized questioning companies on how they are addressing potential and actual inequalities, including racial equity. An example is a shareholder proposal that the fund filed at Amazon asking for an independent audit to assess the company's policies and practices on civil rights, equity, diversity, and inclusion, and how they affect the company's business. Encouraging board diversity has also been an important part of our engagement. During the 2021 proxy season, the fund will vote against all incumbent directors at S&P 500 companies with 0 directors identifying as an underrepresented minority on their boards. I believe investors currently lack standardized disclosure around DEI and in particular board diversity due to inaction by critical market participants, including the SEC. The SEC's inaction has led to some companies taking the position that diversity information is not material, resulting in data often being non-existent, inconsistent, or unusable by investors. As a result, investors, including our fund, must rely on third-party research and data or directly engage with individual companies to gather information. It's time for the SEC to mandate the disclosure of DEI information. More broadly, the subcommittee and the SEC should consider requirements for public disclosure and discussion of DEI issues, such as disclosure of workforce diversity, disclosure of internal pay equity, and disclosure of policies, plans, and strategies to promote inclusion and diversity. Additionally, I support the Improving Corporate Governance Through Diversity Act of 2019, sponsored by my fellow New Yorker, Congressman Meeks. So as State Controller, we're certainly focused on these issues. We look forward to working with this committee to provide more opportunities for underrepresented, particularly Black and Brown asset managers and firms to manage fund assets. I believe that these efforts will have a positive impact for the fund's returns across the economy, leading to wealth creation, new investments, jobs, and opportunities in minority communities. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. DiNapoli. Mr. Garcia-Diaz, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation on your testimony.
Thank you. Chairwoman Beatty, Ranking Member Wagner, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss GAO's work on diversity in the financial services industry. We have long reported that financial firms have struggled to increase the diversity of their senior leadership. After over a decade of limited growth and representation, federal data for 2018 shows that women accounted for only 31% of senior and executive positions, and minorities accounted for 14%. My remarks today are drawn from multiple GAO reports examining diversity practices in the financial services industry, as well as in the government-sponsored housing finance institutions, the Federal Home Loan Banks, and the 2 enterprises, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Specifically, I will focus on how financial services firms, including the Federal Home Loan Banks and the enterprises, use data to assess workforce diversity, and how the Federal Housing Finance Agency, FHFA, oversees diversity efforts of the Federal Home Loan Banks and the enterprises. Our prior work has found general agreement among financial services representatives and other stakeholders on the importance of collecting and analyzing employee data to assess diversity and inclusion efforts. Representatives from large banks noted that analyzing workforce data can help identify leaks in their internal pipeline and better understand why women and minorities are leaving before progressing into management positions. Other stakeholders recognize that knowing your employee demographics is helpful because a firm's workforce should reflect and relate to its customer. One investment firm noted that more than half of the firm's customers were women, and thus its workforce should understand and relate to its client base. In addition, we have highlighted that qualitative data, such as information from surveys of employee viewpoints, can provide important perspectives on the status of these efforts. In response to requests from this committee, we've conducted targeted reviews of the Federal Home Loan Banks and the enterprises in 2019 and 20. Our reviews of these institutions provide additional insights into how diversity data can be used. For example, Federal Home Loan Banks and the enterprises track workforce composition data to compare to benchmarks such as prior year metrics or peer institutions. They monitor recruitment and hiring data to set targets, assess progress, and prioritize outreach and engagement efforts. They set diversity goals for management and leadership as part of their incentive and compensation goals or performance competencies. These institutions also use qualitative data to assess achievement of diversity goals. 9 Federal Home Loan Banks conducted employee surveys, for example, to obtain feedback. Similarly, the enterprises use employee surveys to monitor engagement among women and minority employees. We also reported on FHFA's oversight of workforce diversity of the Federal Home Loan Banks and the enterprises. FHFA reviewed quarterly and annual diversity data and developed forms and instructions for its regulated institutions on periodic and consistent diversity reporting. More notably, in 2017, FHA began conducting annual examinations of diversity and inclusion efforts of its regulated institutions. FHFA reviewed strategic planning and goals, organizational structure of programs, and workforce and supplier demographics. In addition, FHA has examined Federal Home Loan Bank's process for selecting board members and related data reporting. It analyzed information on the bank's outreach efforts and added 2 reporting requirements for gender and race ethnicity data for board directors. While the additional requirements to report on board director race are useful, our 2019 report found that race information was not available for about 8% of the board directors. Further, we noted that individual banks use varying collection methods to obtain required information. As a result, we could not determine whether directors intentionally chose not to self-report their race ethnicity or inadvertently did not respond due to data collection issues. So for this reason, we recommended that FHFA review data collection processes for board demographics to help ensure more complete reporting. We also recommended that FHA communicate effective practices with the individual banks. FHA implemented this recommendation this past year. So in closing, our work points to the importance of collecting and analyzing employee data. Data analysis allows firms to better understand their workforce so that they can tailor their diversity inclusion efforts to better serve their employees and ultimately their clients. This concludes my opening remarks. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you so much, Mr. Garcia-Diaz. Ms. Johnson, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation on your testimony.
Thank you. Chair Waters, Ranking Member McHenry, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to participate in today's hearing. It is an honor to testify before you on the importance of making workforce data disclosures mandatory. This topic is my life's work. I am the Chief Executive Officer of DiversityINC, a business publication dedicated to transparency and the business benefits of diversity, and a warehouse of workforce data for major employers. We have built this data warehouse over 20 years as part of the annual DiversityINC Top 50 competition. This effort is an editorial, empirically data-driven ranking, which focuses on U.S. operations for employers with at least 750 employees. The survey consists of 276 questions that yield more than 1,400 data points and measures human capital diversity metrics, leadership accountability, talent development, workplace practices, supplier diversity, and philanthropy. As a Black woman, wife of a civil servant, daughter of a veteran who proudly served to protect all of us, and mother of 2 children under the age of 10, I am uniquely positioned for such a time as this. As this committee is now considering legislation that would close some of the gaps in how regulated entities disclose their workforce data, let us focus on 3 crucial areas. First, let us look at the lack of data on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Ironically, 1 year and 1 day ago, on March 19th, 2020, the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, Office of Minority and Women Inclusion, hosted a webinar that included an overview of the 2018 Diversity Assessment Report. The self-assessment sent to 1,300 registrants, investment advisors, broker-dealers, municipal advisors, and self-regulatory organizations received only 38 responses, covering only 5% of firms asked to submit a company self-assessment report. Second, and this is the good news, other industries have been openly talking about and disclosing their efforts and showing how they are necessary to achieve ethical corporate governance, profitability, and return on equity. Examples of these companies that complete the DiversityINC survey and rank highly are Johnson & Johnson, AT&T, Kaiser Permanente, Novartis Pharmaceuticals Corporation, Marriott International, Hilton, Eli Lilly and Company, ADP, Accenture, TD Bank, Capital One, Moody's Corporation, and more. All other ranked companies can be seen by visiting DiversityINC.com. The third is the proof we already have of the benefits of how diversity data can exact change. Let us take a closer look at affirmative action. Here are the history and the facts. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy's Executive Order 10925 used affirmative action for the first time by instructing federal contractors to take, quote, affirmative action to assure that applicants are treated equally without regard to race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, end quote. However, it was not until October 1967, following pressure from the surging women's movement, that President Lyndon B. Johnson amended the order to include gender provisions. That gender provision, the collection and required disclosure of gender diversity data, made all the difference. The numbers, presence of women in management named as CEOs and directors of boards of publicly traded companies prove it. After 2 decades of affirmative action and the data being collected and analyzed without bias, it was white women who held the majority of managerial jobs compared to African American, Latino, and Asian American women, the supposed beneficiaries of these policies, according to a 1995 report by the California Senate Government Organization Committee. Today, women are more educated and thriving in the workforce than ever before. And according to a Washington Post article from 2019, for the first time earn more bachelor's, master's, and PhDs than men. Yet we would not know that without the data. Thank you again for the opportunity to appear for you and before you today.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. Ms. Simpson, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation on your testimony.
Thank you kindly. Committee Chair Waters, Ranking Member McHenry, and Subcommittee Chair Beatty, Ranking Subcommittee Member Wagner, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify at today's important hearing. My name is Anne Simpson, and I serve as CalPERS Managing Investment Director for Board Governance and Sustainability. CalPERS has a long-standing concern with diversity, equity, and inclusion. As a fiduciary investor, guided by our duties of loyalty, prudence, and care. We reference this in our investment beliefs, our principles, and our sustainable investment strategy, backed by extensive research through our multi-year Sustainable Investment Research Initiative. Just yesterday, our board adopted a new diversity, equity, and inclusion framework to strengthen our approach across the organization. CalPERS is the largest defined benefit pension fund in the United States, with approximately $450 billion in global assets invested across public and private markets. Delivering investment returns for our beneficiaries over the long term is vital not just to our 2 million members, but also their employers in the community. For every dollar that we pay in benefits, 55 cents comes from investment returns. That's why these issues about performance are so important. CalPERS investment beliefs state that long-term value creation comes from the effective management of 3 forms of capital: financial, physical, and human. So we regard diversity, equity, and inclusion as an integral part of human capital management. And as with all corporate reporting, be it on financial or human capital management, investors need data which are material, reliable, timely, and integrated. Without that data, we simply do not have the full information set for capital allocation, price discovery, litigation, or stewardship, through engagement and proxy voting. And on the latter, I would note that we have engaged over 800 companies since 2017, and over 500 of those companies have appointed diverse board members, partly drawn from our initiative called 3D, which is a database of diverse candidates housed by Aquila. So information is the lifeblood of the capital markets, and when the data set is incomplete, investors are missing vital signals on risk and return. This reminds us to go back to the requirement for material information to be disclosed in full. Incoming SEC Chair Gensler made reference to this vital issue of materiality during a recent hearing of the Senate Committee on Banking, Housing and Urban Affairs. He commented that fundamental securities law requires that material information be provided for investors and in the public interest. And he commented, referencing the relevant Supreme Court cases, and I quote, "Materiality is defined as what reasonable investors are seeking to have in order to make their decisions, either to invest or not to invest, or to vote yes or vote no." As a fiduciary focused on long-term sustainable value creation for our members, CalPERS believes, and a growing body of research increasingly demonstrates, that diversity, equity, and inclusion impact both risk and return. Our principles state diversity should be viewed as multifaceted, and alongside independence and competence, offer the hallmark of a high-quality board of directors. And as has been said earlier, companies with a diverse board, inclusive of gender and race, ethnicity, are better positioned to execute good governance, effective risk management, and optimal decision-making, as well as enhanced customer alignment, employee engagement, and transparency. Voluntary disclosures, quite simply, are not enough. Many companies choose not to disclose, and others comment that they're really not too clear what it is that investors are looking for. For that reason, CalPERS has worked as a founder of the Human Capital Management Coalition of Investors and with the SEC's Investor Advisory Committee to help build a disclosure framework which would begin to fill the gap and provide companies with a cost-effective format for offering this material information to their share owners. The framework covers issues such as employment status, health and safety, workforce pay and benefits, diversity on both race and gender, and more, all backed by research demonstrating the relevance to corporate performance. Of course, one simple immediate step would be for companies to be required to disclose their EEO-1 reports, which would bring one missing element. In conclusion, CalPERS recognizes that investors, companies, policymakers, and civil society all play a role in moving towards diversity, equity, and inclusion. For investors, however, this is not just a moral imperative, it is an economic necessity. We look forward to working with the committee and the subcommittee to further these important issues, which are so important to the public interest and for investors. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Simpson. Mr. Wade, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation on your testimony.
Chairwoman Beatty, Chairwoman Waters, Ranking Member Wagner, and members of the House Financial Services Subcommittee on Diversity and Inclusion, thank you for the opportunity to testify. You know, I grew up in a very small town in South Carolina where the textile industry was once the mainstay of our local economy. And connected to that economy was a vibrant district of Black business owners that we affectionately called the Hill. It was our version of Black Wall Street over in Tulsa, Oklahoma, or Harlem, perhaps in New York City. It was where one could find doctors and lawyers and retail stores, restaurants, fresh food, seafood markets, and other services. These businesses were key anchors in our community, and the owners were our role models. The Hill doesn't exist today. I've seen firsthand how entrepreneurship plays an important role in building wealth in families, communities, and economies. But the opportunity to start and grow a business is not equal for white and Black Americans. Black Americans represent only 9.4% of our country's business owners. Black-owned businesses have lower revenues, fewer employees, and are less than half as likely to get financing as white-owned firms. More concerning is a study from the National Bureau of Economic Research, which reports that 41% of Black-owned businesses have already closed as a result of the pandemic and the downturn economy. Last year, the United States Chamber of Commerce launched a historic Equality of Opportunity initiative to help close race-based opportunity gaps in education, employment, entrepreneurship, criminal justice, health, and wealth. Driven by data and informed by conversations with businesses, governments, academics, and civic leaders, the Equality of Opportunity agenda is about advancing private sector solutions and sound public policies that address inequalities in America. We're proud of our progress thus far. We've hosted over 100 events and meetings with companies and business organizations, endorsed 14 bills on Capitol Hill, released important research and data to help inform our work, and stood up nearly a dozen chamber-wide partnerships and programs. In addition, over 500 state and local chambers of commerce and other groups have signed on to this initiative and are engaging in equality work across their communities. I'm particularly proud of our efforts to help save and grow Black-owned businesses, to enhance the flow of capital, and to connect them to corporate supply chains. Our Chamber Foundation has distributed 600 grants to Black-owned businesses disproportionately impacted by the pandemic in partnership with our Coalition to Back Black Businesses. The coalition will provide $13 million in grants, mentorship opportunities, and resources to these businesses over the next 3 years. Through our alliances with Sky'sTheLimit.org and historically Black colleges and universities, we are also inspiring and developing the next generation of diverse entrepreneurs and business leaders. The Chamber's data-driven approach is foundational to this equality of opportunity agenda. We believe in data. We support efforts by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau to implement Section 1071, which amends the Financial Protection, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, to require that financial institutions collect and report information concerning credit applications made by women or minority-owned businesses and small businesses. We repeatedly support the efforts by Representatives Meeks and Maloney to champion corporate board diversity, and have already endorsed H.R. 1277, the Improving Corporate Governance Through Diversity Act of 2019. Diverse representation, especially Black representation in boardrooms, is still distressingly low. And the Chamber is helping to address this disparity through a partnership with the National Association of Corporate Directors. We've committed to help identify, prepare, and connect at least 250 Black executives to private and public boards by the end of 2022. We need to address diversity urgently and through intentional action, but policymakers should be careful to structure diversity policies in a flexible and durable way. An initiative that might make sense in a highly populated metropolitan area may not work in a rural one. Policies that incorporate flexibility, such as comply or explain model, can shed light on why an internal diversity goal has not been achieved and can help a company think through their shortcomings and plot a new course that can take hold long term. Last year, many companies pledged to address diversity within their organizations, and many are following up with immediate action. However, we do need data to truly identify where the system is broken so that we can analyze, diagnose, and fix it. The Chamber was pleased to see the commitment of 34 major firms voluntarily disclosing government workforce data and publicly sharing their diversity reports by this year. This issue is not just a moral issue, it's about our economic competitiveness. But the reality is that the economic impact and full potential of Black ingenuity and talent has yet to be fully realized in America. The U.S. Chamber looks forward to working with you to fight the good fight, to ensure that all Americans have a fair chance to earn their success, to live out their own American dream. Thank you.
And thank you, Mr. Way. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. And please bear with me. I'm going to try to get a question into everyone. The first question, Ms. Johnson. Am I correct in that hundreds of companies voluntarily share their diversity data with your firm seeking recognition in DiversityINC's top 50?
Yes, that is correct.
Do you believe that the firms who share their diversity data with DiversityINC each year face increased litigation or reputational risk by doing so?
I do not.
Do you have, one might think that there is hypocrisy in financial services firms who are sharing their data in pursuit of recognition or awards, but not wanting to or refusing to share their data with investors, stakeholders, or Congress or regulators. What do you make of this?
I believe that the firms that are sharing their data have found an understanding that this is not about PR or marketing, but this is about profitability. This is about return on equity. And so they understand that they're losing because they don't understand the challenges of their workforce. They're losing people because they are not collecting, analyzing, and studying the right data. So they have found a way to understand how this is profitable, not about the right thing to do or morals only.
Thank you. The next question is for Mr. DiNapoli. The New York State Common Retirement Fund recently launched an initiative to hold publicly traded corporations and their top executives accountable for their diversity, equity, and inclusion policies and practices. Why is diversity, equity, and inclusion performance so critical to the interest of New York employees and retirees?
Thank you, Madam Chair, for that question. We really look at the bottom line, and we believe strongly that the research and the evidence shows that companies that have success with a DEI metric are more likely to present a sustainable, profitable investment opportunity for us. So we think this is very much tied to the bottom line for us.
Thank you. Mr. Wade, I have here the Chamber of Commerce's June of 2019 letter endorsing legislation that would mandate disclosure of boards of diversity data of public companies with the SEC. The Chamber supports mandatory disclosure for board diversity data, but does not support mandatory disclosure of workforce data. Is that true? Can you address that for me, please?
Yeah, excuse me. Yes, Madam Chair. What we're supporting and what we've endorsed is the idea of having the flexibility to allow companies and organizations and financial institutions develop the plans and policies, because there is not one size fits all. And we see tremendous progress even in the area of board diversity.
But don't you think data is data? I mean, if you're collecting it, and I recognize, because in our letter, we also allow them to share other things that might be helpful. So I recognize that. But as we've heard from some of our other experts, that it is important to have the information or the data. And keeping it consistent with your statement that it may be different for a rural area, I agree with that. But you still have to report what you have. Would you agree with that?
Well, I think you're right. I mean, I think that there are companies that are voluntarily reporting this data and giving them the flexibility to put plans in place to execute their diversity plans is extremely important. And we're seeing great successes across the continuum of diversity. Companies are at a different level. And I think it's important that we have plans and give them the flexibility to be able to develop plans that meet them where they are.
But at the end of the day, we need the data. Would you disagree with it's important to have it based on your statement about the value of it? And that would be a yes or no, so I could move on, please.
Yes, Madam Chair. Data is important in all decision making, even in our equality of opportunity.
Thank you.
Data is
Thank
important.
you so much. The next question is for Ms. Simpson. CalPERS has called for publicly traded companies to conduct racial equity audits. What are the goals of these audits, and what do they tell us about a company's value?
Thank you, Chair Beatty, for the question. The importance of a racial equity audit is the ability to actually understand simply where racism shows up in your portfolio as an investor. And right now, if we're asked that question, we can't answer. We can't answer the question of where our capital is deployed, how to exercise stewardship effectively. So we're really just fumbling in the dark. So the purpose of calling for not just the data, but also the standards, this is our work at the SEC, we need to get that information.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm out of time. We'll get you the next time, Mr. Garcia-Diaz. The chair now recognizes the distinguished ranking member for 5 minutes for questions.
I thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and I'd ask those to mute, please, that are not muted, even our witnesses. Thank you. Mr. Wade, it's really great to see you again, sir. What are some practical challenges that your members have faced while trying to increase their diversity recruitment and retention efforts?
You know, one of the biggest challenges which we are seeking to solve for, thank you, Councilman Wagner, is creating the type of pipelines and partnerships and relationships that companies need. And we have to look at this, we believe, and that's why we've advanced this equality of opportunity agenda, the totality of our society. We have to invest in education. We have to deal with the issues of STEM and skills training and retraining and create an expansive pipeline of talent. And I think that is the area that we are finding where we are adding real value and working with companies across America to be able to identify and share and develop best practices that can be shared.
Would the gentleman yield? Would the gentleman yield? Could we please mute? We're getting a lot of feedback from someone or something. Thank you. Could we add time back to Ranking Member Wagner? You may proceed.
I guess that's me who's proceeding. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. And Mr. Wade, thank you. As I've stated before, and I firmly believe, sir, that results, the cultural barriers and attitudes, I'll say, within a workplace cannot be removed through legislation or regulations. You have to get these results for employees and employers with buy-in and active engagement from, I think, the top down. And while diversity data can be a very important measure, this data may not provide a complete picture of the company's commitment. So can you tell me, Mr. Wade, are financial services firms able to tell the full story of their successes and failures just with the reporting of workplace data? And if not, how can they supplement the data to better inform the community of the work that they do?
Yeah, I think data is just one component. You're right. I mean, there are qualitative and quantitative factors that depict and paint the complete picture of a diverse and inclusive environment. We talked about earlier the importance of board diversity, workers and management level positions. Is there a culture of inclusion? Has there been sufficient bias training? Is it a welcoming environment? And I measure and think about diversity not just in terms of numbers of employees, but diversity in terms of your impact in the community, diversity in terms of your connectivity to minority and Black businesses. So there's a totality, I believe, as we think about diversity and inclusion, that we have to consider both quantitative and qualitative.
Thank you. And does success in diversity and inclusion have the same meaning in all regions of the U.S.? We've touched on this, and knowing that, how can a one-size-fits-all approach to disclosing data allow for a company to fully tell their story and show the strides that they are actually making? So give us some of the regional issues and the one-size-fits-all answer here. Thank you.
Well, you're right. There is not a one-size-fits-all, and I think we have to take in consideration geography and demographies across our country. Again, I grew up in rural South Carolina, and the challenges there are vastly different than those in New York City. I took a delegation of our historically Black college students to Silicon Valley to meet with tech executives. And I was struck that some did not want to live in that part of the world. And we have to conclude this in the totality of our conversation as we think about diversity and inclusion. I am really thrilled about the consciousness now around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and that companies are responding. Again, voluntarily, private sector strategies that's being led by business and industry can yield longer term results, certainly, and the flexibility of policies coming from government are extremely important in giving them that flexibility so we can sustain this work for the long haul.
Absolutely right, Mr. Wade. What we have done to increase education and awareness in this area, and so much of the private sector work that's being done is so important. And I think all of your points are important, because the data that tells the whole story can better guide the individual companies. So that whole story's got to be there, as well as their peers, toward making more effective D&I, I think, solutions. Can you talk a little bit about how the quality of data has an impact on a company's efforts?
Well, the quality of data is extremely important. And here's the deal. I think companies are able to see this data from where they exist. They understand the workforce needs of the future. They understand the automation challenges that we're confronted with, and then can invest in communities and invest in HBCUs and in public education. I'm thrilled about an interesting partnership that Howard University has with Google, where Google is sort of teaching from the standards of business and industry. And so I think the quality of data is extremely important, but the source of data is extremely important. And that data that is volunteered, that's seen from the lens and experiences of business and industry is extremely important.
Thank you, Mr. Wade, for all your great work. I've got more questions, Madam Chair, but you know what? We'll have to find time to do this again. So thank you so much.
And I will so note that we can do this again. It is my honor now to recognize the Chair of the Financial Services Committee, the gentle lady from California.
Thank you so very much. I'd like to direct some question to Ms. Ann Simpson, who is CalPERS. I started diversity and inclusion in CalPERS some 30 years ago when I created the Emerging Fund for minority firms to get an opportunity to get their foot in the door. Out of that, some of the most successful firms, minority firms in the country, really did get in and was able to grow and progress. Victor McFarland, who became one of the greatest real estate developers, John Rogers, they all came out of this firm. Now, I'm looking at your testimony, and I failed to hear it all, but I'm looking at how you are saying the SEC needs to do more in enforcing diversity, et cetera, et cetera. What have you done?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yesterday, CalPERS board adopted a new diversity, equity and inclusion framework. This covers the dimensions of our efforts on DEI as an organization. So it includes culture, which has been discussed, it's so important, talent management, supplier. CalPERS spends an enormous amount of money, so the supplier piece is
I'm going to interrupt you. I'm going to interrupt you for a minute.
Sure.
This was done yesterday. I've been gone for over 30 years. And
I apologize.
What happened to my emerging fund? Why was it given up or, now excluded from what you do? What actually have you done to replace that and to make sure that the largest personal employee fund in the country is absolutely exercising real diversity and inclusion? What have you done all these years?
So on the Emerging Manager Program, as you rightly say, Chair Waters, this is a very long-standing program. This was reviewed and restructured, as you know, last year. And the drivers for that were looking at costs and performance and the fit with each of our asset classes.
Okay, so excuse me, I only have a few minutes. So you discarded that. What have you replaced it with? How many minority firms do you have now absolutely managing asset managers, et cetera, dealing with that huge public employees fund and the state teachers employment fund? What do you have?
We have an emerging manager program in private equity. We have an emerging manager program for our real asset class.
How many Black firms do you have?
And in our global equity portfolio, we have 4 external managers following the restructuring. One of them is an emerging manager, Victor Himes, Legato, who I'm sure you know, and the other is a graduate, Aristry, of our emerging manager program.
How many Black firms do you have?
We don't have the ability, due to Proposition 209, to categorize investments by demographics. We have to use our emerging manager formula by size and vintage.
That's not what my emerging legislation did. Can you name one Black firm that you have?
I just did. It's Legato, which is managed by Victor Himes. Legato, which is managed by Victor Himes in our global equity portfolio. I'd like, with respect to that.
How do you spell that?
Himes, Hymes, and Legato, Legato.
Thank you.
I do want also to say that the other element of our work in this area is to extend our understanding of diversity, equity, inclusion across all of our external managers, not just the new emerging manager programs, which are so important to CalPERS. They've not been closed down, they've been restructured, and we are refreshing the strategy. That's the work that's going on now. We also monitor diversity through all of our external managers. We also, through our own work, through our internal management of the fund, and Lennox Park, is the consultant that does that monitoring work for us so that we're gathering in diversity, equity, and inclusion data right across our external manager portfolio, not just for the emerging manager part.
Well, thank you very much. And I'm not just interested in the emerging fund that I created 30 years ago. That should have been improved. It should have grown. You should be able to rattle off any number of firms that are not only diversity firms, such as ones with women, but Blacks, Latinos, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm going to follow up. I haven't had the opportunity to really deal with this, but I've not been happy about what I've learned over the years about what has not happened. As I understand it, you had one some years ago. And so thank you very much. I have to yield back the balance of my time, but I'll follow up with you. Thank you, Ms. Beatty.
Thank you. There's more.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Rose, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Beatty and Ranking Member Wagner for holding this subcommittee hearing, and also thank you to our witnesses for testifying today. I am new to the subcommittee, but look forward to getting up to speed on the important issues in the diversity and inclusion space. The purpose of this hearing is to discuss how data can measure a company's commitment to a diverse workplace. But I think it's important to make sure that the data collected allows companies to tell their own individual stories. There are obvious benefits of a diverse workforce, and each and every company faces unique obstacles in recruiting and retaining one. Several bills attached to this hearing would impose mandatory reporting requirements on companies, and this one-size-fits-all approach concerns me because there are companies of all shapes and sizes in different regions of the country, and I believe these reporting requirements would not put their D&I stories in full context. Mr. Wade, could you explain how one-size-fits-all mandatory reporting requirements could hurt or hinder small businesses across the country?
Thank you, Reverend Rose. We actually believe that there is not one size fits all, as you aptly stated, in terms of business and industry. And one of the areas that we're deeply concerned about are sectors and growing emerging parts of our economy that we need to focus on, and investing in STEM and education and science and technology so that we can have a pipeline of talent and enhance that pipeline for the industries and jobs of the future. So there is not one size fits all. And I quite honestly, I think even as investors are interested in this data, they're also interested in how we're forward leaning and forward thinking about the workforce of the future. So we believe that would be prohibitive to the growth and expansion of our economy, thinking about mandates that require an approach that's one size fit all and comply or explain, where companies can develop programs and policies and initiatives is more appropriate approach as we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion in business.
Well, thank you, and I do think that forward-thinking effort is so important, making sure that there is a pipeline of diverse applicants and individuals who are interested in the jobs across the full spectrum of economic activity is so important, and I've seen that in the rural communities that are a major portion of my district. So it is so important that we be creating role models and setting examples and equipping diverse young men and women for the careers that may lay ahead of them, and inspiring interest in them so that businesses, at least in my part of the country, have a ready pool of diverse qualified individuals to choose from as they try to improve diversity and inclusion in their workforces. Mr. Wade, in your testimony, you referenced the Chamber's equality of opportunity agenda. I agree that we need to work to achieve equality of opportunity. And as I was glad to see that closing the digital education divide was included in that agenda. Over 500,000 Tennesseans only have access to one internet service provider, and 274,000 people still have no access at their place of residence. Can you explain why broadband is a necessity for learning in today's digitized world, especially in the financial services sector?
It's an extraordinarily important part of our infrastructure. And I think as we've seen this play out during this tragic pandemic, where we have kids in certain parts of our country who don't have access to the internet because of lack of broadband infrastructure. And that is the focus of our Equality of Opportunity initiative, to deal with the structural issues that hinder us from creating opportunities for all people to benefit from the economies of our society, including workforce diversity. And so, again, I think that we got to also deal with the structural challenges, whether it's broadband, investing in education, investing in skills, particularly STEM at the K through 12 level. And these are some of the proposals that we're advancing on the policy level, many of which we've already endorsed, as well as private sector solutions. So looking at this from a public-private partnership approach is extremely important if we're going to deal with these issues for the long term and not just the short term.
Thank you, Chairwoman Beatty. I see that my time is expired and I yield back.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the gentle lady from Massachusetts, Ms. Presley, for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. Following the devastating 2008 financial crisis, which had a disproportionate and harmful economic impact on Black and brown women and communities, the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act established the offices of minority and women inclusion across many federal agencies and tasked these offices with collecting and reviewing the diversity and inclusion data of the banks, lenders, insurance agencies, and other entities which they regulate. Now, despite this explicit authority, the Federal Reserve, FDIC, OCC, and SEC jointly issued guidance that made reporting of diversity and inclusion data voluntary, thus weakening the oversight and enforcement intended to prevent and address predatory, discriminatory, and exclusionary actions. I mean, ultimately, collecting this diversity data is certainly not extra credit. This is about holding institutions accountable. So, Ms. Johnson, if you were to fulfill the intent of Dodd-Frank and require regulated entities to disclose diversity data, how would that increase accountability and transparency in the financial services sector?
Thank you for that question. I would be remiss if I did not in this moment acknowledge the loss of the CEO, the late Arne Sorensen of Marriott International. And what I want to say here is that there is this idea that those of us who understand the power of diversity think that people are inherently bad. And I will tell you that the conversations that I was fortunate enough to have with Arne Sorensen usually led to, I didn't know this was happening until I saw the data. And so the opportunity here is for us to learn what has happened, whether it was done intentionally or not, so that we can fix it so that it doesn't happen again. This is not about shaming any industry or any one company. This is about the tide rising and us all rising together.
Sure. And I'm certainly a believer that ultimately that which gets measured gets done. And that is, certainly the importance of data. So how might requiring disclosure of this data ultimately benefit everyday Black and brown and other marginalized consumers who the institutions serve? Could you speak to that component?
Absolutely. So I think the first step is standardizing and making sure that the definitions are all on the same level. So for a very long time, diversity has meant gender diversity. If you look at the methodologies of a lot of the research reports, when you really dig in, it really focuses on gender diversity, hence my testimony. So we have to make sure that we are looking at all dimensions of diversity, not just the ones that give us lift in the news cycle. So that's the first thing. The second thing is consumers, investors are looking for transparency, and you will soon find yourself, if you are not transparent, having people look at products and services that you did not develop or create.
Yeah. Well, I really do commend those entities that have committed to hiring more employees who have been historically underrepresented. But it's also, important that we pay attention to the experiences that those employees have that do gain employment in the financial services sector, to make sure that, these are not environments that feel hostile or where there are microaggressions, but that, people, that we're retaining that talent, that folks have the opportunity to move up because it's an environment where they feel safe and where they can thrive. Mr. Garcia-Diaz, do the Offices of Minority and Women Inclusion collect and review data that can demonstrate whether employees are hired into an atmosphere where they feel included? If not, how could we collect more qualitative information to ensure that financial institutions aren't only reaching diversity benchmarks, but also are ensuring that marginalized workers aren't leaving their jobs or being prevented from fully participating based on some of the things I already enumerated?
Thank you for that question. And yes, our more recent work has looked at one of the regulators, FHFA, Federal Housing Finance Agency, and their work with the the government-sponsored housing finance institutions. And there they are embedding in their processes collection of information directly from these institutions, workforce information, board information, and analyzing it and incorporate it into their regular examination process. And so while that information isn't made public, there is a back and forth with the regulators to understand the status of diversity and inclusion efforts at those firms. But I have to emphasize that that in the case of FHFA, they are dealing with a limited number of regulated institutions.
My time is up. Thank you.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Gonzalez, for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. I'm going to start with Comptroller DiNapoli with my questions. I'm going to try to stick, given the context of this hearing, to data. So you have $247 billion in assets under management, according to your testimony, and I'm trying to piece together what percentage of those funds or those assets are managed by diverse asset managers. So in your testimony, you say 6.7 billion in the emerging manager commitments and then 20 billion in total MWBE investments. So is that 26.7 on 247?
Yeah, I mean, keep in mind, much of our investment portfolio is managed internally by our own staff. So of our externally managed, we're about a 25% by diverse firms. So, that's part of why I'm proud that we have a very diverse team internally, as well as working with many diverse managers.
Okay, so 25% of the external capital is managed by diverse managers. Great. And then what do you see, because that's obviously not fully representative, and I acknowledge the progress because I know it's hard, and this is where I'm going with the question. What do you see as the biggest barriers to increasing that percentage, to having a financial services asset management sector that is more representative of the population at large?
The challenge that we faced over many years is how to access the opportunities, and that in many ways is a two-way street. How do we make sure the doors are wide open, but also how can we explain to potential investment partners how it is that they can develop a relationship with us? So part of what we've done is to have a dedicated staff that works on emerging manager and MWBE investment opportunities. We've grown that staff out. And what we found to be very successful is that we do an annual emerging manager MWBE conference at least once a year. This year we had to do it virtually given COVID, but we had about 800 investment professionals sign up. That provided an opportunity for our team to explain what it is we're looking for in terms of our bottom line, an opportunity to get to know staff. Relationships are very important, building relationships, and also to get to know our external managers, those firms who we deploy capital to let them know how they can pitch them on an opportunity. So, we're pleased with the progress we've made, but we feel we're not finished. We have more work to do. It's about communication. It's about opening the doors. It's about having a pipeline to be developed, and that's what we're always working to improve upon.
Thank you. Thank you for that answer. And then from a performance standpoint, how have the NWBE funds performed relative to their peers?
similar, although in many cases, we've seen a number of instances where they've actually outperformed the traditional relationships, especially with emerging managers, which tend to be newer, younger, hungrier firms, if you will, exposure to niche markets that some of the more traditional relationships haven't given us exposure to. That's also created great opportunities. So from our perspective, it certainly hasn't hurt our bottom line. These firms have done as well, if not better, than the traditional relationships.
Okay. Ms. Simpson, with my minute, what percentage of your assets are managed by diverse asset managers, external, not internal? What percent?
Thank you. Our emerging manager program of our external managers is 1.5 billion. And as I was just explaining earlier, we have restructured and we're in the middle of refreshing our strategy for our emerging manager program.
Thank you. And then 1.5 billion, I'm sorry, 1.5 billion on what total?
20% of our assets approximately are invested by external managers.
So 20% of the 450 billion, so 90 billion, so 1.5 billion on 90 billion. Is that right?
I apologize. I don't want to improvise on the arithmetic. I'd be very happy to come back to you afterwards with those numbers.
Yeah, same question. Well, we only have 30 seconds left, but so I guess I'll just finish with a comment. So when I look at the asset management world, it's clear that we have a ton of work to do. It's primarily dominated by non-diverse and specifically white men, if we're just being honest. And so I think the faster that we can get to a world where we are in the pipeline and creating the programs that allow for diverse asset management, the better we'll be as a country and a profession. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Lynch, for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I want to thank the witnesses for participating. This is a very important issue. So one of the other hats I wear, I'm the chair of the FinTech task force here on financial services. And I think all of the FinTech firms, their whole model and their success is derived from the data that they gather and the data that they utilize. Quite often it's alternative data that actually gives a much more granular and detailed picture of the consumer or the investor. And yet there's really not much data out there for us to know whether or not a truly diverse picture is being gathered with respect to the business community. We don't know. So let me just say this. Algorithm bias continues to be a problem. We've identified it in a few instances where, and we've been able to try to correct that. But because there are so few diverse members of the teams that are putting together these algorithms, it's very difficult to tell whether or not we're not making the same mistakes over and over again and putting minority consumers and minority investors at a disadvantage because of the algorithms that were being used. So I'd like to ask the witnesses: is there any policy that we can inject here to make sure that policies are adopted to make sure that fintechs in particular are not well, let's put it this way, are considering the likelihood or the danger of adopting biased algorithms? Is there a way to prevent those from being adopted? And is there a way to make it systemic so that each and every firm knows when they're putting together these algorithms that danger is out there? Because I've looked, and there's a half dozen studies out there, and they all say that there's not enough data for us to conclusively determine that the algorithm bias has been rooted out. So I think, let me see, I'm not sure who on the panel, Mr. DiNapoli or Ms. Johnson, you might be able to answer that question.
Well, I guess I would, if I understood the question, I would just offer it really underscores the importance of having diverse leadership at the board level, certainly for the kind of companies we invest in, and certainly at the senior management level, for any business. That's how you'll get that diversity of opinion. You'll get a sensitivity on those kinds of issues. So, I think from
reclaiming my time, though.
That's how I would view it.
I'm sorry. Just reclaiming my time.
Yep.
What I'm trying to get at is that the bias is baked into the algorithm. So, I'm very supportive of diversifying the board of directors, but where the rubber meets the road is when these algorithms are actually being put together. And so obviously we need a more intimate involvement at that stage. Mr. Garcia-Diaz, you have some background in this. What are your thoughts?
Well, we haven't looked at the question in certainly the way you framed, but I can address it a little bit with some related work that we've done in the past, looking at, for instance, facial recognition technology, where we talk about how bias can actually intrude in the making of the programming, and particularly when all the programmers are of one group, right? And so without the inclusion of other perspectives, people of different backgrounds, to, in a sense, provide feedback or input into that programming, you can run into the potential risk of bias that becomes systematic because it gets repeated over and over and over again by the different users. And so to the extent, if you apply that more broadly, to the extent that has consequences, say, for lending, there's going to be fair lending considerations, right? And that will raise concerns. But I think this is an area that with the technology, it's so new and we're still trying to figure out what the impact of these biases are.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lynch. Ranking Member Wagner, another member at this time. If there are no other witnesses on the other side, the chair now recognizes the gentle lady from Michigan, Ms. Tlaib, for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you so much, Chairwoman Beatty. I really do appreciate your continued commitment and passion on diversity. I also, as a person that has valued the importance of inclusion of people like us in various spaces that are making decisions that impact our communities, I know that we have to go beyond just, diversity in a sense in the lens of people thinking that just putting our bodies into the room is enough. And we also should be accepting the lived experiences that we bring into that space is critically important. I've seen firsthand in my district, which is the third poorest in the nation, how the lack of diversity among corporate leadership and within financial services industry primarily has directly impacted and harmed my residents. In Wayne County, Michigan, the unemployment rate for Black residents is more than double the unemployment rate for our white neighbors. According to the Brookings Institute, our homes in Black neighborhoods are on average undervalued by $48,000. Black drivers in my district pay a significantly more amount of money for auto insurance, keeping them in the cycle of poverty more than the white drivers for reasons that have nothing to do with their driving history. These are non-driving factors like marital status, education level, credit scores, and so forth. So when it comes to addressing racial disparities in our country and in my district, what we measure does matter. And so, Ms. Johnson, I want to give you an opportunity to really talk about what the lack of, not just putting us into the space, but the lack of really truly allowing us to bring in that lived experience into the corporate leadership room that perpetuates these racist structures that are harming many of my neighbors in the 13th district.
Well, thank you for that question. And I think that if we think about gathering data, like however that data is gathered, I think about the shock and awe that some of my peers went through in watching videos of people being killed by police officers who are supposed to protect them. And so I think that the opportunity to hear from and hear about the experiences of other people, so that we can program and look for the bias, to the earlier question, that is clearly part of most every system that everyday Americans are having to deal with in some shape or form. I think that the opportunity to hear from people, to see and have proof of what's actually happening, is why the diversity data disclosure should be mandatory. If I can just say one more thing, PricewaterhouseCoopers, EY or Ernst & Young, and KPMG have done outstanding work in standardizing how we report out on our financial performance. These three organizations have developed and disclosed a diversity report. And so most of them are advising or doing tax prep work or consulting for most of the companies that we're talking about. Surely, if they have found a way to do this, the companies that they're advising can.
You know, I want to get an opportunity, and I appreciate that. Thank you so much. You know, one of the things I want to stress to the chairwoman and many of us, many of my colleagues, you know, due to a lot of regulatory exemptions, companies held by private equity firms don't have to disclose data on climate risk, labor standards, and yes, diversity, inclusion in the workforce. As many people here testify, I mean, one of the company's CalPERS investment believes that, quote, that long-term value creation requires effective management of financial, physical, and human capital. So, you know, Ms. Simpson, would requiring private equity firms to make mandatory disclosures on diversity and racial equity impair the performance of these investments?
Thank you for the question. In our experience, diversity, equity, and inclusion is good for performance. It's good on risk management and it's good on returns. And so what CalPERS has done is, as part of being a member of ILPA, the Institutional Limited Partners Association, which we helped to found, is support them in developing a template of what are called the DDQs, the due diligence questions, which go through private equity, capital allocation, selection of managers, so that we can start to drive this agenda, drive this conversation through the private markets, where this is just as important as it is in the public markets. Now, you've also seen some innovation in the response. One of our private equity managers quite recently set up a $4 billion credit facility, which will lend at a cheaper rate of interest to those companies which achieve diversity progress on their boards. And I think that's a perfect example where the combination of disclosure and incentives can set the stage for improvement.
Absolutely. And I just want my colleagues on this committee, thank you so much, Mrs. One of the things that I think is really important for us to really be effective on this committee is, you know, the private equity industry controls more than 8,000 companies in the United States. That's more than double the number of publicly traded companies. So I hope that we do take an effort and require them to disclose.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania, Ms. Dean, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you to our witnesses for sharing your expertise and your experience on this important issue. We all believe that we have to remain committed to ensuring all our workplaces, from Congress to the classroom to the C-suite, reflect diversity across our country. We talk about and believe that diversity is our strength, but asking these questions also poses the question that Ms. Simpson just said, where does racism show up in your portfolio? Both are important questions to ask. And so what I wanted to start with was, Ms. Simpson, you explained in your testimony the importance of the benefits of corporations disclosing their diversity metrics. If companies were mandated to do so, what positive effects would you see for your investors and members in the short term and in the long term?
Thank you for the question. We expect two things. First of all, this disclosure means that companies will be paying attention to what matters to their risks and to their returns. And as investors, providing the capital into those companies, this means we're able to be more effective fiduciaries. Without understanding not just what's happening at the top, and diversity is one issue, I do want to say that the framework for human capital management and reporting needs to touch on other issues like health and safety, like employment status, like wages, health, and benefits, because this is the picture that gives us the equity and inclusion dimension when cross-referenced with diversity. And we've argued for that at the SEC. So the benefit is all round to the companies and to investors and, of course, to workers and communities.
Let me ask you another question about that. You mentioned that there would be major problems if a company began to selectively disclose diversity information, choosing what items and what data points they want to share. Explain the danger of that.
Right. This is exactly the same as with financial reporting, in our opinion. So if companies can choose how to calculate profit or what matters for return on capital investment, we just have merry chaos. Even if we're buying food in the supermarket, we expect to see on the label for a tin to understand what's in there, what's good for us, what the standards are. So in every walk of life, we need standards, we need disclosure, and we need it to be regulated. It's no different on this because it really matters to performance.
Thank you. And Mr. Garcia-Diaz, what steps should be taken to convince companies that disclosing diversity data can be a benefit? And I'd also like you to talk about, if you can, just diversity in other areas, not just gender or ethnicity, but I am particularly interested in diversity around people with disabilities.
Yes, so while GAO doesn't have a specific position on public disclosure of information, we do have a position on the importance of having good data about your employees and using that to make important management decisions that affect ultimately the business and their outcomes. And so accurate data and also an intentional effort by management to analyze the data is foundational for the company's own well-being in many ways. And so that would be a couple of things I would highlight in response to
And
your
when you
question.
say analyze the data, is it also analyze and then act upon that data?
Yes. So the data, the analysis of the data will take you up to a certain point, but it should be used to define what your response will be and inform where problems may be in your organizations in terms of either recruiting or retaining diverse staff, regardless of what dimension we're looking at, whether it's race, gender, or disability status, veteran status. All of it begins with good data collection, analysis, and then acting on it.
And could you speak to disability, and if not, maybe Mr. DiNapoli, you could touch on disability in terms of your data collection and your hiring.
Yeah, I would go ahead and defer. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I know we have a couple of months. We've just added disability as one of the measurements on diversity. We're working with advocacy groups in this regard. We certainly stepped up our engagement with companies to be sure that they are including supportive workplaces, hiring policies to promote opportunities for people with disabilities who are severely underrepresented in the workforce across the country.
They are severely underrepresented. They add value to the workplace, to the workforce, to any enterprises endeavors. So I just would say and encourage everybody at this important roundtable to make sure we're analyzing, looking at, and hiring those with different abilities. They bring a lot to the table. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the gentle lady from Texas, Ms. Garcia, for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses today. I've reviewed the testimony and however, I've not been able to be here for most of the hearing because I'm also attending a Judiciary Committee hearing on hate crimes against the Asian American community. And it has struck me, Madam Chair, that in this subcommittee, we often talk about the hidden barriers to diversity in the financial services sector or the historic roots of redlining that perpetuate the racial wealth gap or other forms of soft, even unconscious bias. But the recent attacks against our Asian American brothers and sisters and the hearing in judiciary today highlights that there still remains direct, hard racism in this country. And even in boardrooms and places of business, there is a temptation to think of such hatred as in the past. But we must be mindful that it's still here and it still lives on. I just think we all need to recognize and remember as we have this conversation to be mindful about how much more work still needs to be done. So I want to move on to some questions, and I want to start too with Mr. DiNapoli, can you talk some more about the New York State Common Retirement Fund shareholder proposal to Amazon for racial equity audits and explain to us what that might entail?
Yeah, thank you, Congresswoman. Thank you for those opening comments as well. Obviously, Amazon looms large in all of our lives, especially as a consequence of the COVID-19 pandemic. We've been following very closely media reports that seem to indicate disparate treatment of workers in a number of situations. You take the warehouse workforce at Amazon, largely Black and Latinx employees in terms of safety, working conditions, some of it related to COVID-19, not all of it. Issues related to the fulfillment and distribution facilities, pollution that's caused many of those facilities disproportionately located in non-white neighborhoods, firing of certain workers who are involved with some union activities. So, you know, this was the first effort on our part to say to an important investment in our portfolio, we would like Amazon to look inward. So we're requesting, we filed a shareholder resolution for the company to have a racial equity audit done by an external authority who has credibility to accomplish that. Unfortunately, Amazon has challenged that shareholder resolution with the SEC. They have not made a determination yet as to whether or not our resolution will proceed. We hope it will, but we're looking at other companies as well to take this approach. Again, given the size of Amazon, not only in our portfolio, but in all of our lives, you know, their verbiage and their public pronouncements have been very pro diversity and inclusion and equity, especially after the George Floyd murder. But the reality of what we're hearing on the ground is that there's not a connection between what's being said and what's happening in their facilities.
Well, I hope you continue in your efforts because I think they would be very, very helpful. And of course, transparency does matter. Now I want to move on to Mr. Garcia-Diaz. In GAO's 2019 report on the Federal Home Loan Bank Board diversity study, GAO recommended that the Federal Housing Finance Agency, which oversees the federal home loan banks, should conduct a review of each bank's processes for collecting gender and race ethnicity data. Can you go into more detail about this recommendation and how this data collection process would be effective in diversifying boards?
Absolutely. So the recommendations stem from the fact that complete information on board demographics was not available. About 8% or so, we didn't have any information on them. And so FHFA did require their regulated entities to submit or to collect that kind of information. But what we found was the individual federal home loan banks collected the information in different ways. And it was unclear if the board member intentionally decided not to self-identify, or whether it was something about the data collection methods themselves that may have led to a non-response. And so we recommended that they review the processes that the federal home loan banks had in place to collect that information. Fortunately, I can report that FHFA has taken action. They have reviewed the process, and they are sharing information on effective practices across the federal home loan bank system.
Thank you. My time has ended. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Georgia, Ms. Williams, for 5 minutes. And before we start the clock, let me just say all of us share lifting our hearts up for the tragedy in your great state. The chair recognizes Ms. Williams.
Thank you, Chairwoman, which makes this conversation and others that we're having here in Congress all the more timely because two of the spa shootings happened in my district, not far from my home. So thank you. And thank you for convening this hearing this morning. As we all know, it is well understood that companies should increase diversity because it's the right thing to do. But diversity is also good for the bottom line. And today I want to explore further why diversity isn't just a social benefit, but also a financial benefit for companies and their potential investors. Mr. DiNapoli, in your testimony, you talked about how diverse companies can outperform their competitors. How are diverse companies better positioned to attract and retain talent in their workforce And what can retention of top talent mean for a company's bottom line?
Thank you. Thank you for that question, and sorry for what your community is going through in your district. Look, there's no doubt that the markets are changing and evolving, and diverse companies, from our experience, have been better positioned to take advantage of new market opportunities, to take advantage of untapped consumer interest in products and in services. We're obviously increasingly a services-oriented economy. So companies that reflect the diversity of the community where they're operating can take advantage of market opportunities. And certainly if you have employees that are diverse, and as importantly, you pointed in your question, the ability of retention is very key as well. Obviously, when you integrate someone into a workplace, train them, they become part of the team, you want to have as long-term a relationship as possible. A high turnover of an employee base at any level, especially the leadership level, means you got to start over again. So, one of the points that we always try to make is hiring is certainly an important aspect of it, but retention becomes just as important. So it's the hiring practices. It's also what's happening in the workplace. How is the workplace being supportive? How are you identifying talent? And then providing opportunities for a career ladder as well. So all of these are important considerations. And we also put a priority on that when we look internally, right? So if we're asking companies to do things, I've said to my staff, let's make sure that our own agency, the work that we're doing, we're modeling those best practices in those areas.
Are there other key factors that you'd like to mention that explain why diverse and inclusive companies may see greater productivity, revenue, and market share?
Well, I just think from our experience, we've seen that they have been very often they're newer companies, not always. So there's a certain energy that comes with that. There's an ability to source out niche market opportunities that some of the traditional companies that we may be invested in or our investment relationships just overlook. Again, we're living in a dynamic time. There are many entrepreneurs just starting out new businesses. A lot of what we talk about is some of the bigger investment allocations, but we're also trying to expand upon the opportunities to support small business lending, where you see incredible entrepreneurship opportunities, especially with diverse entrepreneurs. Again, all a way for us to maximize return. As a pension fund, that's got to be our bottom line. But we have found promoting diversity, inclusion, and equity in how we invest very much comes back to a strong benefit. I think it's one of the reasons why our pension fund is actually one of the best funded in the country, because of these investment opportunities that we've been sourcing.
Thank you. And just one further question. How important is the disclosure of diversity data to helping investors understand the future financial success of a company, as well as its commitment to eradicating systemic racism?
As others have said, the data is so very important for us to make our judgments. And I think it's important to point out that if there isn't a standard that's being set, that's required across the board, then we end up having to go, in effect, company by company, or pay for third-party information. It's a cost to us as an investor. So to have standardized, comparable data, we think required by the SEC in terms of what we'd be interested in, will inform us as we do our corporate engagements. And it's so important to keep the discussion going. It's not about shaming or pointing a finger. It's saying we all need to look inward. Public entities need to do that. Certainly corporations do as well. And especially if you're falling short, don't be afraid to hide the information. Let's have a discussion about how we can make those numbers become better. But it all starts with data that's consistent, comparable, timely. That's what we need.
Thank you to all of the witnesses today, and Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Auchincloss.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and to our witnesses today. I'd like to address these questions to Ms. Simpson, and they're about ESG policies. I know that ESG has gone in the last decade from being a relatively marginal consideration to one that is now increasingly driving investment decisions and is driving corporate practices, even though it remains, in the grand scheme of things, a relatively small amount of AUM. Can you talk about the effect that you think your ESG policies are having, not just on the companies directly being invested in, but on companies who are updating their own policies with the expectation that ESG will become the new standard?
Thank you very much for the question. So CalPERS 5 years ago understood that this was a driving force, not just on return, as Tom DiNapoli was explaining, and we fully agree with his comments, but it's also about risk management. So some of the biggest risks in our portfolio are very difficult to manage because we don't have the data. Now, climate change is a great example. When we looked at our total portfolio, we found about 20% of our assets are exposed to climate risk. We've also found big opportunities, particularly in the private markets, where we have about almost 20% of our private market opportunities are in what you might call climate solutions. So this risk and return balance plays out all the way through the ESG agenda. We like to think of it as sustainable investment with these three forms of capital, because we know that producing those financial returns to produce pensions means that we need to be stewards of human capital and of physical capital. So this is good for the returns on the balance sheet, but it's also very important to risk management.
And I know that former Vice President Al Gore has been a leading investor on this front with Generation in London, and he's really made environmental investing a touchstone of how he does it, and has done very well for his fund and for himself and for the companies he invests in, to his credit. Can you talk specifically about whether your criteria and your investments have started to change diversity practices in the firms that you're investing in, or in firms sort of on the frontier that have to watch what you're doing and react accordingly?
Yes, thank you. In our public holdings, which is about half the portfolio, we have something close to 10,000 companies. We also have big exposure in private markets, and that was rightly recognized earlier. What we're finding is that we can have an influence directly through engagement, not just through the dialogue, as our sister fund in New York State has said, but it's also the use of the votes. And what CalPERS has been doing over a period of years is, if we're not seeing progress on board diversity, is actually voting against the chairs of the nominating committee and saying, look, you're falling down on the job. You're not looking at the full range of talent this company needs, because we need boards that are independent, competent, and diverse in order to drive the returns that we need as an investor. So over 500 companies that we've engaged have responded positively and improved, brought diverse directors into the boardroom. And I do want to say this is not just a question of investors creating demand. We've also worked with our sister funds like CalSTRS, New York City, New York State, to create 3D. It's the Diverse Director Data Source, which is an extraordinary pool of talent, so that if any companies really believes it's not easy to find the right mix of independence, competence, and diversity, you can go to this resource and find really wonderful candidates, and it's been a great success. We have over 1,000 diverse candidates that have been sourced through that facility and the associated suite run by Equilar.
Have you seen evidence that greater diversity at the board level induces more diversity in the senior management and then mid-management level as well?
This is an area where the research isn't very good, and here's why. We don't have the data. It's a classic catch-22, where we're sort of, getting handcrafted solutions by trying to gather data directly from individual companies, or paying third parties to give us their opinion on what the status is. So this is tricky. However, CalPERS is very committed to improving the research in this field, and we've actually got a project underway at the moment to commission new research specifically on human capital management, which would enable us to start looking at the impact of having diverse leadership. Until we get the full reporting that we need, it's going to be a case of estimates and guesstimates, which really isn't good enough from a financial perspective.
Thank you, Ms. Simpson. I yield back my time.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, the chairman of the Subcommittee under Financial Services of Oversight and Investigation, Mr. Green, for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Excellent hearing. I'd like to thank the staff as well, because the staff has shared some information with me just this morning that's exceedingly important. I have within my hands a document that is styled "Racial Bias Runs Deep at America's Largest Banks," study says. Madam Chair, with your consent and permission and without objection, I'd like to have this admitted into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, this document indicates, and this, by the way, is from CNN Business, dated March 18th, 2021, that the banking industry has a race problem, and a new study is putting a spotlight on the inequities within the nation's largest financial institutions. Goes on to say that for people of color, the chances of getting promoted to the highest levels of management or senior and executive leadership at some of the nation's most powerful consumer banks are much lower compared to their white peers, according to this report. And the report was compiled by the Committee for Better Banks. One of the things that I'd just like to highlight is what has been highlighted here, and it is this notion that accountability begins with transparency. Accountability begins with transparency. And I'd like to thank all of the members and the witnesses who have made the case for accountability. I need not make that case. So you've laid a proper predicate for what I'd like to go to, which is legislation that I'm proposing with other members of Congress, H.R. 8160. And this is the Promoting Diversity and Inclusion in Banking Act of 2021. Under existing laws, federally regulated depository institutions are scored by financial regulators under the CAMELS rating system, an internationally recognized standard that has evolved since its creation in 1979. To categorize banks' conditions, specifically, CAMELS measures an institution's overall condition with respect to capital adequacy, asset quality, management, earnings, liquidity, and sensitivity. This legislation would add diversity and inclusion to the list of measurements. If we do so, by objectively doing so, D&I efforts would give an additional focus and cause resources to be brought to bear on diversity and inclusion as an essential corporate priority. So I'd like to move to Ms. Johnson. Ms. Johnson, I have a question for you. How can public access to bank diversity data create more accountability for genuine diversity results similar to the ones you measure in your annual surveys?
Thank you for that question, Mr. Green. So according to the Center for American Progress in a 2019 report, corporations lost an estimated $64 billion because of discrimination lawsuits based on orientation, gender, and ethnic discrimination. And so a lot of those organizations were not collecting the same types of data that, by the way, every organization that completes the DiversityINC Top 50 survey, they are completing the same assessment. It is not industry specific. It is not region specific. It is standard across the board. And we are collecting data not just around total workforce, which depending on the type of company it is, may look very good. We're collecting data based on board diversity. We look at gender, ethnicity. We look at veteran status. We look at the trust and disclosure of whether individuals in your leadership team, your workforce, are talking with you about a disability, whether it is seen or unseen. And so we look at all of this information, and we know based on the human resource information systems that it is something corporations can collect. These disclosures, this transparency is not just about consumers, it's also about what you're telling your workforce. Are you being honest with them about the opportunity for them to grow in the organization and one day be a leader in an area which they choose? So this transparency, these disclosures are for external purposes as well as internal treatment and development of your workforce.
Have you had an opportunity, per chance, to peruse the legislation that I have called to your attention, H.R. 8160?
Yes, I have.
A quick assessment, do you find it to be valuable?
Yes, I do.
My hope is that we can pass it in this Congress, and hopefully it will help you with what you do. And Madam Chair, with my last 5 seconds, let me thank you and use some of your language. I thank the Honorable Maxine Waters for putting this Diversity and Inclusion Committee together. And thank you for your leadership of it. Yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank all of our witnesses for their testimony, and certainly I join Chairman Green in not only thanking Chairwoman Waters, but acknowledging her presence for the entire subcommittee. Without objections, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. I ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as you are able to. Without objections, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. I remind members to submit written questions and materials for the record to the email address provided to your staff. Without objections, I would like to submit statements for the record from Alliance for Board Diversity, Elyria, Ariel Investments, Association for Asian American Investment Managers, Garcia Hamilton and Associates, Knight Foundation, National LGBT Chamber of Commerce, New Americans Alliance, and the D&I Diversity Data Request Letter, which asks for data and allows for flexibilities for all of the companies to share any additional information they have. The hearing is now adjourned.